Africa's 2026 story is being misread if we reduce it to one word: crisis, because that is not what the evidence says. The IMF and the World Bank still point to growth across sub-Saharan Africa this year. That matters, but the stronger reading is not simply that growth exists. It is that growth is holding under weaker confidence, thinner cushions, and much less room for error. And that matters, because the continent is not moving at one speed. Countries like Kenya, Côte d'Ivoire, and Benin still sit in a different market conversation from countries under restructuring pressure. Larger economies like Nigeria and South Africa still carry weight, but scale does not remove inflation, energy, or fiscal strain. And countries such as Ethiopia still sit inside a much more complex mix of recovery, financing pressure, and reform credibility. So the correct reading is not, Africa is collapsing. The correct reading is, growth is still there, but the margin is thinner. The headline survives, but the cost of being wrong is higher. This is where the story becomes more serious, because when aid shrinks, it does not shrink into a vacuum. It shrinks into countries with very different levels of fragility, domestic revenue capacity, debt access, and humanitarian exposure. That means the pressure is not evenly distributed. For countries like Somalia, the issue is not just development finance. It is continuity of basic state support and humanitarian resilience. For Niger, Liberia, Central African Republic, and Burundi, the issue is how much lost concessional support can realistically be replaced without pushing even more pressure onto already constrained public systems. For Mozambique and Uganda, the question is how external support interacts with domestic fiscal limits and service delivery. For Ethiopia, the story is more complex. Reform, recovery, debt pressure, and external financing all sit in the same frame. And for larger economies such as Kenya, Nigeria, Tanzania, South Africa, Côte d'Ivoire, and Tunisia, the issue is not identical to fragile aid-dependent states. But thinner concessional support still matters, because it changes the balance between domestic strain, commercial borrowing pressure, and reform credibility. This is why the aid story must never be told as one continental number only. The number matters, but the distribution of pain matters more. Some countries lose comfort, others lose time, and some lose basic room to breathe. The third layer of this story is how distant shocks become local costs. And again, the wrong version is the dramatic version. This is not the story that Africa suddenly runs out tomorrow. The real story is slower and more important. When conflict or instability disrupts major energy and shipping routes, Africa can feel that pressure through fuel, freight, insurance, and fertilizer. That does not land the same way everywhere. In Malawi, fertilizer affordability matters because agricultural input pressure can show up later in planting decisions and eventually food prices. In Ghana, imported cost pressure and currency sensitivity can make external shocks more visible at household level. In South Africa, fuel and logistics costs matter inside a much larger industrial and consumer economy where transport costs travel widely. And in Nigeria, the external fuel shock lands inside an already sensitive domestic environment, shaped by inflation, reform politics, and energy pricing. So the key point is not panic. The key point is transmission. A distant geopolitical shock can still become an African cost of living story. Not always through the headline, often through the bill. If the aid story is uneven, the debt story is even more so. Because Africa does not have one debt story anymore. It has at least two. There are countries still negotiating from pressure, and there are countries still negotiating from relative confidence. For Ghana, the key issue is whether restructuring progress becomes durable room to move, not just a headline of relief. For Zambia, the question remains what post-default recovery actually looks like in practice. Long negotiations, slow confidence rebuilding, and limited comfort even after milestones. For Ethiopia, the financing conversation is still tied to broader restructuring, reform, and recovery complexity. And then there is a different lane. Countries such as Kenya, Benin, and Côte d'Ivoire speak more to selective market access, investor confidence, and the fact that some sovereigns can still move, even in tighter global conditions. That difference matters, because debt is not only what is owed. Debt measures how much room a state still has to choose. Can it refinance? Can it invest? Can it absorb a shock? Can it borrow without panic pricing? That is why Africa's debt crisis is no longer precise enough. The more accurate phrase is Africa's two-speed financing reality. This week's Social News Watch is a reminder that public pressure can become dangerous when bad framing outruns evidence. South Africa's migrant tensions are real. That part should not be denied. There have been visible incidents, protests and public anger around migration, jobs, crime narratives, and local political pressure. And the issue has become regionally visible enough that Ghana has also entered the conversation through public concern and reactions tied to attacks on foreign nationals, but blanket claims online that collapse the issue into all Black South Africans. Hate other Africans are not analysis. They are distortion. The responsible reading is harder. A real social and political tension exists. It is uneven. It is emotionally charged. It can become violent. And it is being flattened online into racial shorthand that hides class, policing, local politics, unemployment, and opportunistic mobilization. So the rule here is simple. Acknowledge the tension. Reject the flattening. Ghana remains a key watch point, because restructuring progress does not mean the pressure is over. The real test is whether restored credibility becomes durable fiscal room. Zambia remains one of the clearest tests of what post-default recovery looks like. In practice, long negotiations, slow relief, and the challenge of rebuilding confidence after formal milestones. Some African issuers still show selective market access or stronger financing confidence than distressed peers, that is Kenya, Benin, and Côte d'Ivoire. That does not remove pressure. It confirms that Africa's financing story is uneven. For Nigeria and South Africa, large economies still anchor continental weight, but domestic inflation, energy costs, logistics strain, and reform politics mean scale alone does not equal comfort. So what is Africa's real story this week? Not collapse, not comfort either. The continent is still growing in important places, but the cushion is thinner. Aid is shrinking, debt is costlier, external shocks are still feeding through, and the room to respond is narrowing unevenly. That is why this week's episode matters. Because the real question is no longer only whether growth survives. The real question is, which countries still have room to choose, and which are being pushed into narrower and narrower options? And that is where the next decade will be decided. Thanks for watching, and see you next week for the weekly news roundup across the African continent. Documentation over reaction. Evidence first. Context always.